lockdown switch networks of today and wireless access points. But anyway, there's all these different EAP and EAP-FAST and PEEP and EAP-TLS, all kinds of different standards that can be spoken to the Windows or Novell or Netscape directory server. So this device over here doesn't have to be a Radius or TACACS server. It can't be if it's TACACS, because that's Cisco proprietary. The ACS server acts as a translator from one AAA protocol to another. Now we see authorization. Authorization, we can implement time of day restrictions, like you can only log on from 8 to 5. Resource restrictions, you can only access these IP addresses. Connection limits, this many users with this username can be logged on at the same time. And command limits, and these are just a few, commands being what you can type in on a router or switch. Accounting, the records can be stored either locally on this ACS server, so you can actually browse the records and see what users did using the ACS server, or you can store it in CSV, that stands for comma separated value, or ODBC, which is an open database format that is widely supported. SQL can handle that, Oracle can handle that. So if you have a larger network where you want to do all this accounting into a large database system, you can export all this to an ODBC format that can be read and well understood by databases. Finally, let's compare our two street fighters, or protocols, TACACS and Radius, to see what the big differences are. Now you could go down and you could actually make quite a list of differences, but it boils down to these three. TACACS Plus, which is the newest version of TACACS, is Cisco proprietary. So, right there, if you've got Cisco routers and Juniper routers and HP routers and switches and all that kind of stuff, immediately TACACS gets ruled out because all of these different devices don't support the TACACS protocol. Radius is an industry standard, so everything supports using Radius to communicate to some central database. TACACS separates authentication and authorization. So what that means is, let's say you've got a user who authenticates to this router. The router will go to, we'll just say, the Cisco ACS server and say, ACS server, is this user allowed? And the ACS server will come back and say, yes, that username and password is valid, they're allowed in. Now that user tries to type the show IP interface command, and the router then flips back around and says, server, is the show IP interface command valid by this user? Yes, that command is valid by that user. It's every single thing. Authentication and authorization, meaning who you are and what you can do, are separate in TACACS. Whereas Radius, it's combined in one big exchange. So when the user comes in and says, hello, my name is Jeremy with the password of Cisco, the router goes over to the ACS or Windows server and says, hi, is this username and password valid? And the server comes back and says, yes, and here's everything that they're able to do. You know, this is their privilege level. Now, what that does is rely a lot on this router for the configuration. Whereas TACACS, every command is compared against the database of commands that can be typed. With Radius, it just comes back and says they are privilege level 5, which means on the router I've got to define this privilege level 5. Level 5 can do all these individual commands. Now we can template that and use copy and paste to get that into all of our devices, but Radius is not as centralized in that sense, to where authorization is all separate with those different commands. And most Radius servers, again, aren't going to have a list of commands or access list capabilities like the Cisco ACS server. Finally, encryption-wise, TACACS encrypts the whole packet, meaning when this guy says, I'm Jeremy with the password of Cisco, it encrypts all of that, sending it to the ACS server. Only the header is shown, whereas Radius just encrypts the password. So if somebody has a packet sniffer right here, they'll say, I see a username of Jeremy just came through. I can't see their password because it's encrypted, but I see that, you know, they have half the puzzle. The username that I am going to start trying to hack now is Jeremy. So that's the big comparison between the two, and let me boil it down to this. If you are using the ACS server or a centralized database for just user authentication, meaning I've got all of these routers and I just don't want to type in the same username and password on all of them, or I want a system where I can have a central database where I have my username, Jeremy, and a password will say of Cisco right now, but in a month that's going to change to Cisco 1, and my passwords are going to keep changing all around as I go through, and I want that to be reflected on all these devices. If it's just that simple, use Radius. That's great. That's what Radius is there for, is I don't have to create user accounts on every single one of these. I can have a centralized database for that. However, if I want to be able to get detailed, and I want to say, well, the user Jeremy, when he logs in, has these restrictions, can type these commands, can access these resources on this time of day. If you're going to do that, then use the TACACS server, specifically the Cisco ACS platform. There's no reason to buy ACS if you just want to do user and password authentication. If you want to apply all the specific restrictions, that's what it's designed for. Now let's get into how we can configure our routers to support AAA and switches as well. This is across the board. First thing I need to do is get to my router, move into global configuration mode, and I'm going to type in AAA ? You can see that as soon as I type in this new model command, AAA new model, it enables new access control commands and functions, disables old commands. What that means is that when I type in AAA, it's going to say, okay, all the old ways of doing authentication, they're gone. You now have all these new methods that are created. For example, you used to go underneath the VTY ports and type in password Cisco to assign a Telnet or SSH password. No more. When you type in AAA new model, I'm not using that username or that password underneath the VTY ports. We're using a totally new way of doing things, the AAA way. So as soon as I hit this, look at this. I'll type in AAA ? Again. Notice up here, one command. Now when I hit ? It's like wham! All of these new commands have been opened up because I've enabled this on my router. Now before you go any further on this, you want to make sure that you don't lock yourself out of the router. It's easy to do when you're configuring AAA because doing this, it even notes, disables the old commands. The old password under your VTY ports is no longer used. Now it's going to be looking to use usernames and passwords that are at least locally configured on the router. So here's a quick way to lock yourself out of the router. Let's say you've got a VTY password you're using for Telnet and an enable secret. You type in AAA new model, save your config, and log out. You are now going to be locked out of your router because all of the ports are going to be configured to use by default local authentication, which means check the local database on the router, see if there's any usernames configured in that local database on the router. And if you haven't configured any usernames and passwords, you're doomed. You can't get in the router. You have to actually do password recovery and break into the router because you'll be locked out. So definitely don't just type in AAA new model and then go, I can't remember after that, and walk away, because you will lock yourself out. So after that, we now have to type in AAA and choose what method we would like. We have AAA authentication, AAA authorization, and AAA accounting. There's our three different A's in our AAA. The most obvious one to configure first is AAA authentication. Now before I even go there, we haven't yet configured a TACACS or a Radius server. Now, just so happens that I've got over here my Windows 2003 box, and Cisco has on their website a 90-day eval copy of the ACS server for Windows. So you can set up a Windows server and try this for 90 days, full features, full functions, and just see if you like it. So what you can do is on Windows get this thing set up, and it's just, you can see trial. You can't actually download the full version from Cisco's website. You do need a CCO login. So you just go through, it's pretty much a next finish button to install the ACS server. It says, before you begin, the following items must be complete. End user clients can successfully connect to AAA clients, so you have to be able to log into your routers. The Windows server can ping the AAA clients. Any Cisco iOS AAA client is running iOS 11.1 or later. If you're running 11.1 or earlier, you need to upgrade. That's old. We're talking probably 8, 9, 10 years old. And then you're also using Internet Explorer 6.0 or 7.0, Netscape 8.0, or Firefox 2.0. So good news is Cisco has now made this browser capable. It just says, make sure all of this is true before you install this. Hit the next button. It's going to be a basic wizard. Let me pause the video and just click next through this to get this thing running. Oh, okay, I couldn't do it. I had to show you this. As you're going through the installation, it does ask you the question on the ACS server. Are you going to use an internal database, meaning the ACS server has everything? Or are you going to integrate this with the Windows user database? And if so, the Windows Active Directory, when you configure users, has this grant dial-in permission. It was used for dial-up users, and it's now used for VPN users. And it says, do you want to refer to this to allow or deny dial-up or VPN access to this if you use Windows? Well, I'm not going to use Windows. I'll use the ACS server. So it's going to do its copy shindig, and then I'll bring the video back. Alright, now I've got my ACS server running, and it's working in, you can see, a Internet Explorer web browser. That's how you do all of the management. Now, before we go any further, I've got to configure my router to speak with my ACS server. So I'm going to open a command prompt and do a quick ipconfig just to find out what the IP address is of my ACS server. 172.30.100.229. Remember that. Now I'm going to flip over to my router,